Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
Several months later, she actually admitted to me that she had been engaged by Securitate to be my informer.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. In 1967, a young British professor found himself in Bucharest, Romania under the most intriguing circumstances. Ron Mackay shares his fascinating experiences as he navigated life and teaching in a communist country. From the moment he set foot on Romanian soil, he was met with both challenges and intrigue. Yet amidst the restrictions, he found beauty in the Romanian culture, architecture and the resilience of its people. Despite the oppressive environment, his students were eager to learn and engage, offering him a glimpse into their lives and aspirations. The episode also explores his adventures beyond the classroom, from navigating the bustling streets of Bucharest to travelling through picturesque Romanian countryside, his encounters with locals, fellow expatriates and even a mysterious British engineer. I'm delighted to welcome Ron Mackay to our Cold War conversation.
I was just coming up to writing my final exams when I went out of the library one day, picked up the Guardian newspaper and saw an advertisement asking for an exchange professor of phonetics for Bucharest University. And what was most intriguing about it, it said recent graduate might suit. And so that's the job that I applied for. And without any qualification whatsoever in phonetics, I was given the post.
Why do you think you got the post? Because whilst I was reading your book, I noticed that you felt there were better qualified applicants.
There were 3 better qualified applicants, and all 3 of them, when we met in London for the interview, they thought that I had just been invited because they needed to invite an alternate. They thought I was the alternate, and I did as well. But during the interview, they asked me questions not about my academic qualifications, but questions about my previous life. Had I lived abroad? How had I found living abroad? How had I learned the language? Had I been lonely? Had I felt that I was capable of handling the difficulties that I encountered? And of course, these were second nature to me. So they focused on that aspect of my background rather than on the qualifications. I think what they were really looking for was someone who wouldn't go to Bucharest, find it impossible to live under the conditions that the communist government forced not only its own citizens to live under, but foreigners, even worse, and resign and come home. I think they just wanted somebody to last out the year, and I managed to last 2 years.
How much did you know about Eastern Europe in general or about Romania before you left?
Very little. I knew what everybody else knew, that Hungary had been invaded by the Soviet Union in, was it 56? And we had done geography at school, good geography. And I remember the name Cluj from my school days, CLUJ. We called it Cluj. And Cluj was also the public toilets, and that's why it stuck in my head. So when I looked at the map of Romania to find out about Bucharest, I saw Cluj and I thought, gee, I'd really like to go there. But I knew very little, almost nothing about Eastern Europe before I left.
So you were interviewed by the Foreign Office. Did they
Yes.
brief you or give you any sort of preparation for being there?
Remarkably little. I hadn't any more than maybe a 20-minute briefing from a young man who wasn't much older than myself. He'd be in his mid to late 20s. And he started off by saying, I've never been in Romania myself, but it's my job to brief you about what you might expect in Romania. And what he told me was that there was a law of association which would make it difficult for Romanians to speak to me and dangerous for me to speak to Romanians, to make the initial bid to speak to Romanians. So it was going to be a lonely post. That's the first thing that he stressed. The second thing that he stressed was that I would not have diplomatic immunity. I wasn't going as a diplomat. I was going part of a bilateral cultural exchange, which had recently been renewed. And I was employed by Bucharest University and not directly by the British government. I had to become a non-resident of Britain to accept the post. And I was resident abroad, non-resident of Britain. I was resident abroad for these 2 years. I was going to get an apartment from the Romanian government. I was going to get a monthly salary in local currency, the lei, which was soft currency. You couldn't exchange it. You couldn't take it out of the country. And I got the sum of £30 sterling paid into my British bank account every month that I was away. That was basically it.
Wow. Well, and I think it's probably worth stating the position of Romania at this point during the Cold War, because it's seen by the West as being a sort of quite independent country within the Eastern Bloc. Britain's trying to do trade agreements with them, and Ceausescu is seen as sort of trying to make the country a bit more independent, almost like Yugoslavia.
Yes, that's true. And when I went there in '67, Ceausescu was into his fourth year as the premier. He had taken over basically from Gheorghe Dej, who also took a slightly more independent line from the Soviet Union than many other East European countries did. He actually switched off the oil pipeline that went from the Ploiești oil fields up into the Soviet Union, and that established him as a more independent person. But the local population they knew this, but they also felt that as a result, Romania and the Communist Party had to have greater internal control over their people to compensate for this more independent foreign policy.
And hence that law of association, for example, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, so you travelled to Bucharest by train from Paris. Can you describe what that journey was like?
It was a very exciting journey in some ways. I had just graduated from university, and I hadn't had time to go and work that summer because I only had 6 weeks to get ready to take up the post in Bucharest. So I didn't have any money, and I was too inexperienced to have asked the Foreign Office for an advance. So I was told that I would have my expenses reimbursed after I got to Bucharest, but I actually didn't have any money to spend. And so I sat up on the train from Paris through Germany to Vienna. And then I took bread and cheese with me from Paris. I didn't have enough money to go to the dining car. And I did the same when we changed trains at the Hungarian border. And I next ate when I got to Budapest. But I did meet an Indian diplomat on the train. He was going to take up a post as third secretary in the Indian embassy in Bucharest, and we made friends. I could never go to the dining car with him because I didn't have enough money to pay. But he was escorted off the train at the Hungarian border because his papers weren't in order, as were many other people escorted off the train by the Hungarian military. But it was exciting. It was something completely new for me. The countryside was exciting. Train journeys are exciting. And here I was going on the so-called Orient Express through from Austria into Hungary to Budapest, and then from Budapest down to Bucharest. the train went on. It didn't go as far as Istanbul in those days, I don't think. It went on to Sofia alone.
What did your friends and family think of you going deep into the Eastern Bloc?
Well, I had always been a fairly independent person. And when I left school, I was turned down for agriculture in Aberdeen University. And I was so disappointed, I decided that I would try to work my way on boats to Argentina, where my great-grandfather disappeared in the 1890s. I got as far as Tenerife and couldn't find a boat from Tenerife going across the Atlantic. I ran out of money and I lived there for a year. I learned the language. I lived in a small village. I worked in a banana plantation. And so my family was pretty used to me doing rather unusual things. So they didn't raise their eyebrows when I said, I'm off to Bucharest.
Brilliant, brilliant. And what happened when you first arrived? Was there anybody there to greet you?
Yes, there was. The acting cultural attaché in the British legation, the equivalent of the British embassy, she met me at the Gara de Nord in Bucharest and drove me and my one suitcase to the apartment that was assigned to me by the university. She gave me the keys to the apartment. She gave me a few rolls of lei, local currency to spend, and said, come into the embassy next week to meet the cultural attaché, Tony Mann, and we'll get to know you then. So I had 3 or 4 days on my own, entirely on my own, not being able to speak the language and not knowing anybody. It was a baptism of fire.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. So, what were your first impressions of Bucharest, and how did you manage to fend for yourself those first few days?
Well, that very first night, I learned a lot. I went out to find a restaurant, and I went into a restaurant, and of course, I was looked at as a strange creature. Romanians could tell immediately that you weren't one of them from the clothes you were wearing, and they weren't used to seeing a Westerner at all. So no one spoke to me. I sat at a table by myself, and a waiter didn't even come near me. I had to insist to be served. And when I was served, the only thing on the menu were pickled gherkins and cheese. That was it. The beer had all finished. The food had all finished. There was nothing other than that. And that was quite common in those days in Romania. I discovered that often you went into a restaurant and there was only cheese and gherkins. So that first evening, I walked back to my apartment. And what struck me was there were very few people on the street. The street lights were extremely dim. It was very dark. There was still public transport working, but very few people on the public transport. And it was not exactly a welcoming evening that I had that first night. But the next few days, I walked into the center of Bucharest. I was maybe a mile or two from the university square where I was supposed to be teaching. And I found the building where I was supposed to teach. It was closed. The public transport was very good. I didn't use it to begin with because I didn't know how it worked, whether you paid in advance or paid the driver. So I walked in. But there were no private cars. There were virtually no private cars in those days. When a car did appear, it usually was a huge Russian Zif or Zim or Chaika or a Mercedes-Benz. That was a very prestigious car for Communist Party members to have in those days. And they had curtains on them, so you couldn't see who was in the back of these limousines. You could only see the chauffeur driver who wore a cloth cap. And I found myself staring at these and discovering that people were staring at me because I was staring at these Communist Party members driving in these big cars when they preferred not to look at what they were seeing. They just kept their eyes straight ahead and went about their business. It was a very elegant city. The buildings were absolutely magnificent, beautiful, very different from Edinburgh or Manchester or London. The churches were beautiful. The Romanian Orthodox churches were beautiful, but everything looked as though it had been neglected for years and years and years. Everything was slightly shabby, breaking down, peeling. Plaster was coming off the walls. The windows were peeling. Sometimes there were rifle shot holes around windows where a sniper had been attacked by army during the war. It was lovely. People were dressed the way we dressed in Scotland in the 40s and the early 50s, in rather old clothes, dark clothes. There were many peasants. You could tell they were peasants because they dressed in a more regional fashion. They had embroidered waistcoats. They wore beautiful caracul hats on their heads. I sought after these and I got myself one as well. They were very beautiful. Cachula, they were called. It was quite romantic for me to be there, but of course I didn't know anybody. The law of association was such that people spotted me on the street as a foreigner, looked at me very curiously, but simply passed on and avoided my eyes if I tried to catch their eyes. So I was on my own pretty well, I would say, for the first 2 or 3 weeks before eventually I started teaching my classes.
When you first arrive at Bucharest University, what's that like? What's the welcome like there?
Well, I was actually instructed by the rector's office about 3 days after I arrived. I was told I had to call at the rector's office. I did. I was shown into an enormous boardroom by a rather unfriendly lady who sat me down, and without a smile on her face, she told me that she gave me the inventory of the apartment that I'd been given. And I was told that the inventory would be checked when I left and nothing had to be broken or removed. She told me that I would be paid at the Communist Party base, the Base, as it was called in the university, every month, that I couldn't exchange or take the lei out of the country. And she told me that I could not leave the city unless I wrote to the university rector 2 weeks in advance, told him where I was going, when I was going, how I was going to travel, and then if I was given permission, it would be sent to me in a letter and I could leave the city to travel if I wanted. That was the initial introduction that I had from the university. She also told me that the professor of English, Professor Anna Cartianu, would contact me and give me my teaching schedule. Well, I waited a few days. I waited a week. I waited 10 days. Nobody contacted me at all. I went to the university. It was closed. It was still vacation time. And so I took it upon myself to find out Anna Cartianu's address, and I visited her at her apartment. And I was given a very cold welcome. You didn't do that kind of thing in Romania at that time. You didn't go to somebody's house unannounced or uninvited. And she spoke to me for about 10 minutes and said somebody would contact me. And sure enough, the next day, the dean, a delightful gentleman, Ioan Preda was his name, he called me on the telephone in my apartment and invited me for lunch and gave me my teaching assignment, told me the times of my classes, told me my responsibilities, and so everything went swimmingly from that point on.
So, not the warmest welcome to begin with, by the sound of it. There. So you had an apartment to yourself, because I imagine that's quite unusual in Romania.
It was very unusual. I discovered it was very unusual. And of course, I had never had an apartment to myself before in my life. I had been a student in Aberdeen, and I had shared a basement apartment with 4 or 5, a flat as we called it, with 4 or 5 other people. So to have an apartment to myself, it had a bedroom and a sitting room, a kitchen and a bathroom, and central heating, which was a real delight to me, in a high-rise building. The building was maybe 6 or 8 floors high, was a real pleasure. But there was an elevator in the building, and I embarrassed people if I got into the elevator with anybody else. They didn't want to be in the elevator with a Westerner. And so I stopped using the elevator to avoid them being embarrassed by me, and I used the stairs to go up and down for the rest of my time in Bucharest.
It sounds like you're on quite a budget there. So, did you cook for yourself, and what was it like trying to go out and buy food for cooking?
Well, there appeared to be lots of shops, but when you approached them, you discovered that the majority of them were closed, or they had a little notice in the window to say that they would be open for an hour or two on a certain day. And sure enough, if you went to the store that day, you would find a huge queue standing outside the butcher's shop or the grocer's shop, waiting, hoping that there would be something to buy when they reached the counter. And basically, under these circumstances, you didn't ask for what you wanted, you asked for what you could get. And I remember being given a huge pig's liver when I had asked for beef. And you came out of a store, and people would stand around with their packages. They would open their packages, and you could swap what you had for what somebody else had. That's how you basically ended up with what you wanted.
Wow, wow! Can't imagine that taken on at Tesco's or anywhere.
Well, sometimes it was even worse than that. Sometimes when something had been off the market for a long time, for example, toilet rolls simply didn't exist for a long time. And a truck might arrive with toilet rolls, but there would be such a crowd round the truck that the trucker wouldn't be able to deliver the toilet rolls to the store, so the store employees had to come outside and sell the toilet rolls directly off the back of the truck.
Wow, wow. I mean, you mentioned your first experience of Bucharest's restaurants. Did you frequent many of the restaurants?
Well, I didn't really, because I was used to cooking for myself, and I found that I could buy most of what I wanted at the peasants' market once a week. In Piazza Unirii, there was a huge peasants' market, and you could get virtually anything that you wanted: vegetables, eggs, chicken, meat. You had to pay for it, but I was paid in lei, so I wasn't short of local currency, and I could find virtually anything that I needed there, except sugar. And I started using honey as the sweetener, and I've used honey ever since 1967 as the sweetener of choice because there was no sugar available at all. But I did find 2 excellent restaurants. I found that the Athene Palace Hotel had a very good restaurant, and it always had food, because that is where foreign delegations came to visit when they to stay when they came to Bucharest. they came to the Athene Palace as the principal hotel. And there was another very luxurious restaurant called Captcha's. It had red velvet curtains and beautiful furniture inside it. And it was reputed to be the place where the Central Committee members frequented, and also East Germans. At that time, Romania had a thing about East German spies, and Captcha's was supposed to be the place where the East German spies and the Central Committee members hung out. And so if I were going out somewhere or wanted to take somebody somewhere, I would take them either to the Athene Palace or to Captcha's.
Can you remember teaching your first lesson at the university and the reaction of your students?
Yes, well, I'll tell you first about going to the staff room, the teacher's staff room, the professor's staff room, before going to my class. I went to the staff room at the invitation of Jon Preda to meet on the first day my colleagues, and there must have been about 15 or 20 of them, and they were embarrassed by my presence. They smiled, they shook my hand, and one by one they slipped away because of the law of association. If they spoke to me, if they had a conversation with me, then they would have to have gone to the communist base in the building and reported the conversation in detail. The conversation would be added to their personal security dossier, and then, of course, it could be used against them at any time in the future. If they were looking for promotion, or if they were applying for a passport to go on holiday somewhere, or if they, for any reason, their dossier could be used against them. So rather than report a conversation, the faculty members tended simply to greet me very warmly and avoid me. That says nothing about them. It simply says something about the fear that they lived under, because they were absolutely delightful people. They were wonderfully qualified. They knew their subjects inside out. They were excellent teachers. They were loved by their students. But the Communist Party and the Securitate ruled them by fear. They were afraid through this law of association to associate with me. So I stopped using the faculty staff room, and I used to go directly to my class. That was the highlight of my time there, was my classroom, because I had small classes of young, enthusiastic students, both men and women, and they would speak to me in class about anything, of course, other than politics or anything personal. You couldn't ask them personal questions. You couldn't talk about politics at all. But they were a delight to be with. They listened to you very carefully. They conducted their exercises very well. They did their assignments. They could talk about their assignments. They spoke English extremely well, quite remarkably well. They were, I had experience previously in Spain, and they had the enthusiasm of the Spanish, but they had something the Spanish didn't have, which was attention to detail. Romanians, I found, had enormous attention to detail, and I discovered why. When they graduated, they were given jobs by the state. They couldn't choose their job. They couldn't choose where they wanted to work. They were actually assigned a job. And so they had to work extremely hard in order to be close to the top of the class and stay in Bucharest, first of all, or a major city. And the lower down in the class they were when they graduated, the further they were from civilization. And they might have ended up in a small village in a rural part of the country, which they didn't want.
So the law of association didn't apply in a teaching environment, by the sound of it.
It didn't apply in the classroom at all. My students, if they spoke to me in the classroom, which of course they did not have to report the conversations at the Communist Party Base. But I discovered that there was an informant in the class, and the informant was the person who would report on presumably, I don't know this for certain, but they would report on my teaching, they would report on things that I said, and if I happened to say anything untoward, they would report that. I don't think I did say anything untoward at any of the time I was there, and I didn't know who the informant in my classroom in the first year was, but I discovered who the informant was in my second year.
One of the many details that made me laugh in the book is I think that the female students you had took great delight in trying to embarrass you in class.
Yes, they did indeed. Let me see. How should I put this? Number one, I found Romanian women very good looking. Many of them were very beautiful, and many of my students were very beautiful. And for some reason or other, it seemed that there weren't the undergarments that we were used to in the West available to them. So from the waist upwards, you could see just about everything through the clothes they were wearing. And they knew this. It was not something they did on purpose. It was simply that there seemed to be a lack of undergarments in the country, because you could go on a bus and see exactly the same kind of thing. But they also were interested in talking about their adventures, their love life, and seeing how embarrassed I could get. And remember, I was a Presbyterian Scot. This is I was born in 1942. We were brought up in a rather strict environment. And to me, their environment was much more liberal than the experience that I had had either at school or at university. They could see this, and they saw that it embarrassed me, and they took a delight in doing it.
The book, Ron, is packed full of these little details in here. I mean, we're only scratching the surface here. But I mean, you mentioned the informant in your class. Were you aware of being under surveillance?
Well, shortly after I arrived, the cultural attaché told me to give him the key to my apartment and not to go to my apartment for a couple of hours. And he said that the embassy technicians would check the bugs or the apparatus, the listening apparatus in my apartment. I assumed that they were going to deactivate it. He told me they couldn't do that. All they wanted to do was to check to see the kind of technology that the Romanians were using. And so when the technicians came back, Tony told me that yes, my telephone was bugged, and yes, there were listening devices throughout the apartment. So that's all he could tell me. So there I was definitely under surveillance inside my apartment. And it didn't particularly bother me. What I used to do, I would play tricks on the surveillance equipment. I would quietly open the front door of my apartment, ring the bell, and then pretend there was somebody coming into my apartment. And I would speak to them in Scots, or I would speak to them in English, or I'd speak to them in Spanish. And I'd go on like this for maybe 25 or 30 minutes just to give the translators something to do. I don't know if they ever managed to translate the Scots that I spoke to them. So I played little tricks on them like that. In the street, I didn't notice that I was being followed. I can't say that I spotted those who were following me, except in one case, and it was somebody from my own class, and I'll tell you about that later. But I was assured that I was followed by Romanians. Romanians believed that Securitate followed every Westerner 24 hours a day. And so I would get on a tram car or a trolley bus at about the time of night when people were going home, thinking that my agent, the agent following me, was just winding his day down and hoping to go home for supper to his wife. And I would take the trolley bus miles to the other side of the city and then turn around and take it back again. And I would look to see who was on the bus going, who turned round and came back on the bus with me. I was never really able to identify individual people who might have been following me. I can tell you about the first person who was assigned as my informant to inform on me was a beautiful young woman who came to the university and talked to me between my classes one day. And I knew right away something was strange. She used a name that I was born with, but had changed by deed poll and had not used in my application to the Foreign Office to apply for the post in Bucharest. So when she came out with that name, I thought to myself, you got that from somewhere else. You got it from somebody else. You couldn't possibly have seen it in any of the documentation of the cultural exchange. And the second thing that surprised me was that when I arranged to meet her after class, and she told me that she wanted me to return a dictionary to my predecessor, to a fellow called Martin Murrell, who, with his wife and his two children, had spent the previous year in Bucharest. But she didn't have the dictionary with her. And I thought, that's pretty strange. You come to ask somebody if they will return the dictionary for you, but you don't bring the dictionary with you. And she suggested that she might show me a bit of Bucharest. And of course, I had been on my own at that time for at least a month, speaking to virtually nobody, but occasionally somebody in the British embassy. So I took her up on that. And later, several months later, she actually admitted to me, under rather unusual circumstances, that she had been engaged by Securitate to be my informer, and that if I stopped seeing her, then it would be a failure in her case. It would count against her, and she might not get what she was looking for, which was an invitation to join the Communist Party. Because through joining the Communist Party, you had access to a better accommodation, maybe even an apartment, better jobs, then possibly a passport to go on holiday somewhere. Istanbul was the commonplace in those days, and so was Paris, and so was West Germany. But she actually admitted to me after a few months. So we made an arrangement that I would continue to see her. She would continue to report on me, continue to do her job for Securitate. She said she wouldn't say anything incriminating about me, not that there was anything much to say incriminating. And at the end of the year, she said, I will never bother you again. And in fact, she didn't. I bumped into her one day the following year in the street. And as she was walking towards me, I recognized her and I was about to greet her when she walked straight past me. Her job had been done. I hope she got her apartment. I hope she became a member of the Communist Party. She'd done her job.
Wow. That's fascinating. Fascinating. You said earlier that the university had said that if you wanted to travel outside of Bucharest, you had to give 2 weeks' notice. But you don't adhere to that, do you?
No. As she said it to me, I was surprised. I thought to myself, lady, that's your job. That's not my job. You're asking me to police myself, and I will not police myself. So I'm going to travel. It's up to you to stop me if you want to stop me. And in fact, I left the city the very first weekend after she told me that. Nothing happened. I bought a ticket on the train, return ticket to the Prahova Valley, which was only maybe an hour away from Bucharest, an hour and a half. And I often visited the Bucharest Mountains in the Carpathians, and nothing ever happened to me as a result of leaving without permission.
And when you travelled on those trips, had you picked up some modicum of Romanian so that you could actually converse with people?
Yes, before I went to Bucharest, I thought, well, I'm going to be supposedly teaching phonetics in Bucharest University. At least I'll find out about the sound system of Romanian. So I went to Edinburgh University. I only had about 6 weeks between being appointed to the job and actually arriving in Bucharest. But I went to Edinburgh University and listened to the sound system of Romanian and realized that there was some similarity between Romanian and Latin, and also Romanian and Spanish, because Romanian is a Romance language. It's the only Latin language that developed to the east of the Roman Empire. All the other Romance languages developed to the west of the Roman Empire. So it is rather different from all the other Romance languages. But I did learn a fair amount of Romanian. I could never, ever pass as a Romanian. I speak Spanish now with my wife and have done for the last 25 years and could still not pass as a native Spanish speaker. So these stories you see in films about somebody spending their summers in France and then passing off as a Frenchman, I think are much exaggerated. Yes, I learned a fair bit of Spanish, a fair bit of Romanian. I could conduct all my daily business without any difficulty in Romanian. But when it came to conversations, I had a challenge because conversations can take a turn or a direction that are unpredictable. And it takes a long time to learn enough of a foreign language to feel comfortable in informal conversational situations.
In those rural areas, did you find that people were more prepared to talk to you?
Yes, they were. The peasants in these rural areas were much less. I don't think they even knew about the law of association. Um, I used to borrow the consul's car, or the consul used to lend me her car because she often went back to Britain for leave, and she would leave her car with me. So I started using her car quite a bit going into the rural areas. And if I parked a car in a village and walked down a village street and admired the flowers, somebody behind the fence would smile at me and tell me the name of the flowers. And even although they could tell immediately from my dress and also from my accent that I was not Romanian, it didn't seem to bother them. They would invite me into their garden. They might even invite me into their house and show me their little house and the ceramic stove they used to heat it and the icons they had on their walls. So it was always a pleasure for me to get out into the countryside. And I was used to country people. I'd worked with the equivalent of peasants in Tenerife when I worked in the banana plantations, and I had worked on farms in Scotland, so I could relate very easily to these rural people.
And how easy was it to get accommodation overnight in these places?
Well, Romanians traveled internally in Romania, and there was a tourist office for Romanians in every town. A Romanian could go to the tourist office and ask for overnight accommodation. There were hotels, there were guest houses, and there were also private homes. You could buy a bed overnight in. And so I started doing the same thing. I would travel, go to the Romanian tourist office, and say that I wanted accommodation. And mostly, of course, I was directed to hotels because I would spend much more money in a hotel, and they didn't particularly want me going to a private house. But soon after, I soon learned how to get to a private house. I preferred to be in a bed and breakfast with Romanians, and there were ways of going about it.
Now, I read in your book that you come across a British guy who is he has a business selling excavators, I think, to the Romanians.
Yes. Ron Walker, his name was, from Derby, from a company called Mackay. It was a hydraulic excavation company. One of the most interesting people I have met in my entire life. He would be, at that time, maybe in his early 40s. He contacted me. We became good friends. He came regularly throughout Eastern Europe to check on the excavators that had been sold by his company to these countries. In Romania, one of his biggest projects was draining part of the Dobruja area, which is the area where the Danube turns north after the border with Bulgaria and then comes out in the delta. And it's where the Romanian government used slave labor to try to build a shortcut to the Danube Canal. Well, he had sold excavators there, and he would take me to the sites where he had his excavators. But Ron was a most unusual person. He always drove when he came to Bucharest. He never really told me where he'd been before coming to Bucharest, but I knew he stopped off in other East European countries. He spoke Romanian, and I thought that was the only foreign language he spoke, until at one point, at the end of my first year, he said he was returning to the UK the following week, and I could go with him if I wanted. And we drove through Hungary, and I discovered he could speak Hungarian. And then we got to Austria, and he could speak German. And then Switzerland and Germany, and then the Netherlands, and we took the boat from the Hook of Holland back to the UK. He was a most unusual person and a delightful person to be with.
Yeah, I think in the book it appears as though he's got a woman at every location that you stop at.
Yes, he did. He had a permanent girlfriend in Romania. And when we got to the Hungarian border, that time we were driving back together, I think we had just crossed the border and stopped the car to buy a cup of coffee or something. And a woman happened to come by, and it was clear that they were very close friends. And then the following night, we got as far as Austria, and we stopped in a German or Austrian city. And again, there was we stayed the night in a woman's house. So he was one of the most unusual people I've ever met in my life. Now, when you were in Romania, when you were behind the Iron Country, you never really knew who you were dealing with, either on the Romanian side or on the British side. So it wouldn't have surprised me if Ron Walker had had much more training than simply in hydraulic excavators.
His access to the country and his proficiency in languages would indicate that he might have had some other role. Now, the British embassy contact you at one point and say, we can get you a really cheap Land Rover.
Well, that was one of the two British guards at the British embassy. The British embassy, or the legation as it was called then, had two Romanian guards outside it. And the Romanian guard's job was to report on anybody who came and went. But inside the gates of the embassy, it was an old mansion house converted into an embassy. There were 2 British guards, and they had lots of responsibilities. I had spent 2 years in the TA OTC, the Gordon Highlanders, and I had been in many warrant officers' mess, and I could spot these 2 guards were either currently British Army or had been British Army or had been some kind of police force, and they were a delight. They knew everything. They saw everything. They also had arms. I was with them once when they were cleaning. Shotguns are what I saw, which is a crowd control measure for military people. But Bob, the one I had most contact with, he contacted me one day. It was towards the end of my first year, and he said to me, "I can get you a long wheelbase Land Rover, which has been used by a British contractor here. He no longer has any use for it. And there's only one condition, and that is you've got to let me let other people use it whenever there's a demand." And he got it so cheap. I think it was £100 or £120. And so I had the Land Rover. It took me from the embassy to my house and never worked for me again. But he would call me from time to time and say, "Your Land Rover is needed for the next few days." And I would say, "It's not working." And he would say, "Don't worry about it." And sure enough, my Land Rover disappeared and then came back again. And if I checked the odometer, it had miles on it. And I got so frustrated with this that I decided, Ron Walker brought me back a manual for the Land Rover, which was a very simple vehicle. It was built as an agricultural vehicle originally, and it was made for farmers to fix. And when I checked the fuel lines, I discovered that there was a reservoir in the fuel line with an on-off screw, and it would only drive for a few hundred yards or maybe a mile with the screw turned off. And no air would get into the system, so it would, if you turned it on again, it would start automatically. But for some reason or other, Bob didn't tell me about that. And the people who used it, I never found out who they were, obviously knew how to turn on and off the fuel. And that was how I got into trouble one day when I discovered, it was in May of 1967, May 1968. It was a holiday from the university, and I thought, I'm going to take a look at my Land Rover and find out what's wrong with it. And I found this fuel valve, or the fuel reservoir, and switched it on, turned it on, checked the amount of fuel that I had in the tank, decided I needed some more, and wanted to give the Land Rover a run. So I ran the Land Rover through the center of Bucharest, Piazza Romana, Piazza Victoriae, and then up Aviatorilor to where I knew there was a gas station, and I filled up with gas. And I was surprised there was nobody on the street. There were no traffic on the street. And I thought, this is really unusual. So I turned the Land Rover around, and I was driving back down Aviatorilor towards Piazza Victoriae, and there were hundreds of people behind barriers on the street side waving flags. And I was the only vehicle driving down this enormous boulevard, totally free of public traffic or anything else. And I thought, I had no idea what was happening. And then suddenly the militia, the milizeni, they came by on motorcycles with their lights flashing and pulled me into the side and asked what the hell I thought I was doing. And I was still puzzled. And they got me off the road, and they gave me a flag and told me to wave it. And a few minutes later, an enormous parade with a huge car came down the boulevard. And I thought to myself, well, maybe maybe there's been a revolution. Maybe Ceausescu has been deposed and this is the new president coming, because he was coming from Otopeni Airport. And then I looked more closely at the figure in the car, and it was Charles de Gaulle. He was standing up in the car with his cap, that kepi that he always wears, and his huge nose. He was a huge individual, and he was accepting the adulation of the crowd. So I was minutes off spoiling his procession into the center of Bucharest. And there was a complaint lodged against me to the British Embassy, but because all of the contact with Securitate went to the embassy guards, Bob called me in and said, "What the hell were you doing the day that de Gaulle came? Look, you were forced off the road by the Militseni and they've made a complaint." And of course, I explained that I didn't know what was going on. And he said, "Well, don't worry about it. Sir won't learn anything about your misdemeanor." Sir was Sir John Chadwick, the ambassador. He said, "Sir won't learn anything about this."
Brilliant. Brilliant. In July 1968, you're advised to leave Romania and return in September. And whilst you're in the UK, you have a series of interesting encounters, I'll say, because at one point you bump into Ron Walker, the HIMAC engineer.
Well, I had a few days free because I'd gone to visit my brother on his Vulcan base in, I think it was Waddington, and he was busy. And he lent me his wife's car and said, "Come back in 3 days' time." So I drove up to Derby and called Ron Walker, and he refused even to recognize who I was. And I was puzzled by that, and I kind of insisted, maybe too much. And he said, "I'll see you back in Romania. Don't call me again."
We're going to have to leave it there for this week, but make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss out next week's episode where Ron continues his story. There's links in the episode notes for you to buy the book and support the podcast. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and look forward to seeing you next week.